In 2016, a Boeing engineer made an internal note about a software fix he'd just shipped. He described it as a quick workaround that avoided delaying a flight test because, in his words, any delay would cost Boeing a very big amount of money. That single sentence, buried in a routine work log, captures the entire culture that produced the most expensive corporate safety crisis in aviation history. Boeing's direct costs from the 737 MAX crisis have been documented at approximately $20 billion, $8.6 billion in compensation paid to airline customers, $5 billion in unusual production costs, and $6.3 billion in increased program expenses. Add the $2.5 billion criminal settlement with the Department of Justice, and Boeing's own disclosed total crosses $20.7 billion. Industry analysts who include canceled orders and indirect losses put the real number above $60 billion. Here's what makes that number worth examining closely. Almost every decision that led to it was made to save a much smaller amount of money. This is the story of what Boeing was trying to save and what it actually cost. For most of the 20th century, Boeing's identity in the aerospace industry was built on a specific reputation. Engineers ran the company, and engineering decisions were not subject to override by finance. The 707 in the 1950s, the 747 in the 1960s, the 777 in the 1990s, each represented genuine technical risk-taking backed by a culture where the people who understood the physics of flight had more authority than the people who managed the budget. Pilots and airlines trusted the Boeing name specifically because that reputation was earned over decades. That culture began shifting after 1997 when Boeing merged with McDonnell Douglas, a deal structured, by most accounts from people who worked through it, more like an acquisition of Boeing's engineering culture by McDonnell Douglas's finance-driven management style than the other way around. Cost discipline, shareholder returns, and quarterly performance increasingly competed with engineering judgment for the final word on major decisions. By the early 2000s, that shift had fully arrived at the 737 program, Boeing's best-selling aircraft and the foundation of its commercial business for 50 years. In the early 2000s, Boeing needed an answer to a specific competitive threat. Airbus had launched the A320neo, a more fuel-efficient version of its narrow-body jet, and airlines were taking notice. Boeing's answer was the 737 MAX, a new variant of the 737 with larger, more efficient engines. Those larger engines, mounted farther forward and higher than on previous 737 models, changed the aircraft's aerodynamic behavior at certain flight angles. Boeing's solution was a piece of software called the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, or MCAS, designed to automatically adjust the plane's tail to compensate. Here's where the money entered the engineering decision. Boeing had promised Southwest Airlines, the largest 737 MAX customer, a rebate reportedly worth $1 million per aircraft if pilots ended up needing simulator training to fly the new model. Avoiding that simulator requirement became a defined business objective, not just an engineering nice-to-have. To avoid triggering a simulator mandate, MCAS was kept out of the pilot manual entirely and built to rely on a single angle of attack sensor rather than a redundant pair. Test pilots were not given full technical detail on the system. The version of MCAS that reached production had narrower safeguards than earlier engineering drafts. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 crashed into the Java Sea after MCAS activated repeatedly based on faulty data from that single sensor, killing 189 people. On March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed under nearly identical circumstances, killing 157 people. The two accidents killed 346 people combined. The rebate Boeing was trying to protect was worth roughly $1 million per aircraft across a production run. The crisis that followed cost more than $20 billion. The ratio between what was being saved and what was ultimately lost is not subtle. The MCAS censor decision wasn't the only place cost pressure shaped the MAX program. Through the 2000s, Boeing and several of its major suppliers increasingly outsourced software development to contractors paid significantly less than in-house engineers. In some documented cases, as little as $9 an hour. Indian firms including HCL Technologies and Cyient took on substantial software work for Boeing programs, including flight display and flight test software connected to the 737 MAX and the 787 Dreamliner. Boeing has stated that MCAS itself was not developed by these outside contractors, but former Boeing engineers who spoke to reporters described a broader pattern. Experienced engineers were being laid off at the same time software work was being pushed to lower-cost contractors, often with limited aerospace background, who needed multiple rounds of revision to get specifications right. One former Boeing software engineer described the arrangement as far less efficient than simply having Boeing's own engineers write the code, a cost-saving measure that, by his account, may not have saved money even before accounting for the quality risk. The pattern reflects a consistent decision-making logic across the MAX program. Take the option that reduces line item cost today, even when people inside the company were raising concerns about what that option gave up. The global grounding of the 737 MAX began in March 2019, days after the Ethiopian Airlines crash, when regulators around the world, followed by the United States, pulled the aircraft from service. It would not return to commercial flight in the US until November 2020, 20 months later. CEO Dennis Muhlenberg was removed by Boeing's board in December 2019. His successor, Dave Calhoun, inherited a company facing the most expensive accountability process in its history. In January 2021, Boeing agreed to pay over $2.5 billion to resolve a criminal conspiracy charge from the Department of Justice, which found that Boeing employees had concealed material information about MCAS from the FAA during certification. The settlement included victim compensation, a fine, and compensation to airline customers. By the time all direct costs were tallied, customer compensation, production disruption, program cost increases, the criminal settlement, storage and retraining costs not included in the official total, Boeing's own disclosed figures totaled approximately $20.7 billion. Boeing also borrowed roughly $14 billion from U.S. banks and issued an additional $25 billion in debt to manage the financial strain, compounded by the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic's impact on global air travel. More than 1,200 orders were canceled or removed from Boeing's backlog. Airbus overtook Boeing as the world's largest aerospace company by revenue in 2019, a position it had not previously held in the modern era. If the story ended with the 2021 settlement, it would already be a costly cautionary tale. It didn't end there. On January 5, 2024, a door plug, a panel covering an unused emergency exit, blew off Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 at 16,000 feet shortly after takeoff from Portland, Oregon. No one was killed, in large part due to the flight crew's response, but the incident exposed that 4 bolts meant to secure the panel had not been properly installed. The panel had been built and installed by Spirit Aerosystems, the fuselage supplier Boeing had spun off as an independent public company 2 decades earlier, a structure that, according to aerospace analysts, had created a misalignment where a separate company was financially incentivized to cut costs on a part installed in Boeing's own aircraft. The FAA capped 737 production at 38 aircraft per month following the incident, and conducted an audit that found what investigators described as a pattern of process control failures and inconsistent parts handling. Boeing fined $3.1 million by the FAA over the violations brought Spirit Aerosystems back in-house through a $4.7 billion acquisition that closed in December 2025 and brought in a new CEO, Kelly Ortberg, in August 2024, specifically tasked with rebuilding the company's manufacturing discipline. Ortberg has since described the goal as replacing finance-driven, remote control management with engineers running an engineering company again, language that is itself an acknowledgement of how far the original culture had drifted. A company that had already paid over $20 billion to learn that cutting corners on safety systems is catastrophically expensive, needed a second, less severe accident 5 years later to fully act on the lesson. So how does one of the most respected engineering organizations in industrial history end up paying $20 billion to relearn something its own founding culture already knew? First, they let a marketing promise dictate an engineering specification. The decision to keep MCAS reliant on a single sensor and out of the pilot manual wasn't made by engineers solving a technical problem in isolation. It was made under pressure to avoid triggering a contractual rebate tied to simulator training. When a commercial commitment made before a plane is fully designed starts constraining what the engineering team is allowed to build, the organization has already inverted the order of operations that kept Boeing's reputation intact for 70 years. The rebate was the tail. It ended up wagging the dog. Second, they treated outsourcing as a cost line instead of a risk transfer. Whether it was HCL's $9 an hour software contractors or Spirit AeroSystems fuselage production, Boeing's approach to outsourcing during this period consistently optimized for the visible number: the hourly rate, the per unit fuselage cost, without pricing in the coordination overhead, the quality variance, and the accountability gap that comes with handing safety-critical work to an external organization with different incentives. The door plug bolts weren't missed because nobody at Spirit or Boeing knew how to install a bolt. They were missed because the system connecting the company that built the part to the company that flew the plane had gaps that cost optimization helped create. Third, one accident wasn't enough to force the cultural correction. The 737 MAX grounding produced new leadership, a criminal settlement, and considerable public contrition. It did not, by Boeing's own later admission, produce a complete reversal of the finance over engineering culture that caused the crisis. It took a second, highly public failure, the door plug incident in January 2024, and a second new CEO explicitly brought in to reverse the McDonnell Douglas era management approach before the correction reached the scale the first crisis should have demanded. Boeing's recovery under Kelly Ortberg has shown real progress. Production of the 737 MAX has stabilized. The company reacquired Spirit AeroSystems to close the incentive gap that contributed to the door plug failure. Boeing beat Airbus in net orders in 2025 for the first time in years. But the arithmetic of this story doesn't change with a better ending. Boeing spent something in the range of $20 billion, plus tens of billions more in canceled orders, borrowed debt, and reputational cost that doesn't show up on a balance sheet, to avoid spending a fraction of that amount on simulator training, experienced engineers, and direct oversight of a safety-critical supplier. Every cost-cutting decision in this story had a name attached to a specific dollar figure: a $1 million rebate, a $9 hourly rate, a cheaper outsourcing contract. Every one of those figures was real money that someone, somewhere inside Boeing, was credited with saving. None of those people are remembered for the savings. They're remembered, if they're remembered at all, for what those savings cost.